basis, mess you made.
Start out a little bit differently. I feel like I am supposed to share with you a couple of different updates that are happening in the body. One, my son Reed, he's 6 next week. He's been challenging us in ways to press into the Lord. 6. So the other day he was, trust me, I'm going somewhere with this. If you don't have kids, you'll still relate, right? So he was riding ahead of his sister. She gets really scared because we're ahead of her on a scooter, and she's crying out. And he goes, ugh, like this, and goes back and goes and gets her and rides along with her. And I was thinking, hey, as a 6-year-old, my sister's whining, I got to do this thing out of obligation. And he comes back, and then she turns around and he's like, let's race home. And she takes off, and he goes ahead and he stops after a couple of paces. And he goes, Dad, I had to. And I said, had to do what? He's like, God told me that I would feel bad if I didn't love her and tell her that I wanted her to be with me. So I had to go do it. And I said, is he talking to you a lot? He's talking to me all the time. And he's like, I can't go anywhere without him. And my kid's blowing the socks off me because we can't really go anywhere without him. We can't really go anywhere without him. So when he laid down this challenge to me, he said that the Lord told him if we prayed, make sure I get this right. Make sure I get this one right, guys. Yeah, okay. If we pray for Conrad for 11 days, that his hearing would start to be restored. And Conrad, can you look at Becky? And so in the midst of the 11 days, because 11 days ends on Tuesday of this week, in the midst of the 11 days, we had our conference or whatever last weekend. And the night that I wasn't able to make it for the whole night, I found out that Lee and Brandon and other people prayed for Conrad, and he started to hear a little bit that night. So I believe that the Lord is moving, and I want to challenge us to two things, too. Pat's dad, remind me, Larry, right, had a gallbladder issue, and that got removed, and he's in a nursing home. And basically, you're seeing the Lord breathe new life into him. He's being encouraged and understanding who his dad is. And those moments where you realize that God's intersecting your life, right? Too often we look back in the past, we say, man, how good was God because he intervened in that moment. Rarely do we see things in the exact moment that it's happening and look on it with as much value as it actually has. Those people in the moment when they see God moving, we usually call them romantics. Oh, those people are they you know what I mean? They're over sensationalizing the moment, but do they truly just realize the significance of the moment? And so I want to challenge us to two things as a body. One, that we're not a body of comfortable pew sitters. We don't have any pews, so we can't be that, right? But we try not to be people that just get together just to do another thing. So the two things I want to do is we're going to take about 2 to 3 minutes. We're going to make this quick. And I want to divide up between Conrad and pray for Pat, right? Sort of as a substitution for his father for those two things. Pat, for your father to be restored, that he knows that the healing comes from his father, and 2, for hearing to be restored. And I want to challenge us to keep praying for 2 more days for Conrad as a body, because I want to see us respond to what God's doing, and not just be in a moment of we're hoping for the promise and we're going to get disappointed if we don't see it, right? So for 2 to 3 minutes, I'm going to really challenge us to get up from wherever you're at. They're both in the same sort of spot, but lay hands on them as you feel led. We're going to do this pretty quick. And I say if you feel led, let's do this as a body. Let's activate what God's doing right now. Father, thank you for what you're doing in this place, Father God, that the families that you're forming together right now into one will be united in you, God. That everything spoken in your name will reign true. Oh, gosh. So what now? He's up back in the kids' church right now. Mm, mm. God, we thank you for what you're doing in the midst of this body today. Father, how can we call ourselves a family if we don't come together in your name to do the things that you've called us to do? Father, we thank you for the restoration of Conrad's hearing. Father, for the restoration of Pat's father's body. God, you speak a better word than any affliction that could come onto a physical body. You speak a better word that could come against any mental onslaught, any lie that could enter into this body. Father, you speak a better word to everything. I hope that this stuff becomes more normal, to be honest with you. I hope that it becomes more normal. And I feel like we're in this season, we're definitely in a season of transition, right? That's very easy to say, but I tangibly know some things that are coming down the pipe. But we get too often somehow fixed on benchmarks, right? So like if we plan for a vacation, or you plan that somebody's coming, or school's about to get out, right? We have these things that in our mind, we picture them as like finish lines. That once we get to that finish line, things will be better. I remember anticipating getting married, right? Once I get married, man, it felt like a finish line, right? And everybody who's been married starts laughing, right? Because it's not a finish line, it's a starting line. You start a commitment to something, right? And so what I want to get our perspective on is seasons of transition or starting lines. When we're looking forward to something, they're starting lines of what God's about to do. but you're currently living, right, where you've passed the starting line, so you're in the middle of a race right now. So you're not doing nothing in the waiting, right? We're anticipating the starting line for the next season, for what God's going to do. And we kind of get frustrated. I myself, sometimes we feel like either I'm not doing what I should be doing because things are stagnant or they're slow, or you just don't feel, I would say, like the wind in your sails. Or you have an encounter with the Lord where you know tangibly He's moving in the moment, and you get so amped up and so fired up that you know 100% that God is with you, that He's real, that He's speaking to you, that He loves you, that He can talk to you, that you can hear it. Everything about it is so encouraging. Pat's lit up because he sees his dad heart changing and softening. Yes. And it feels like a breath of fresh air to see that thing happen. Like, God, you are moving. You are real, that you do talk to us, that you love us, that you're good. You're nothing but good. But give it 3 or 4 days and it feels like the wind's gone, and then you could feel like still waters, right? So I just want to encourage us in this. The Bible has, I love it because there's so much that God has embedded in there for us to dig out. So Isaiah 54, and Tina doesn't have a slide for this, but I really felt like the Lord had given me this during a time of worship. That is actually a direct word of encouragement from the Lord to His people. Now, at this time, I'm going to give you a little bit of context, right? So 54:10, if you want to get close to the address. His people had been warned not to do a certain thing, right? And as we do the thing, right? So they did the thing that they weren't supposed to do, and now they're in captivity. And God says, hey, for 70 years you're going to be there. So this word was in the midst of those people who were stuck in that spot. So Isaiah 54:10. So if you ever feel like you're stuck in a spot and God's not present, this is His heart towards you when you feel like you're stuck. Right? This is His word. So 54:10. I'm going to try to read this without crying. You know what? If we can't be honest with who we are personally, it's really hard for us to be honest with God. That's free. For the mountains may be removed and the hills may shake. Think about how in your life, these are things, the hills and the mountains, the things in your life you never thought were going to change. The unmovable aspects of your life. A dad that was always going to be there. A job that was always going to be secure. Your kids that always love you and talk to you a certain way. Think of those things. The mountains and the hills. The things that will never be moved. It says, for the mountains may be removed and the hills may shake. But my favor will not be removed from you. Nor will my covenant of peace be shaken, says the Lord who has compassion on you. Afflicted one, storm-tossed and not comforted. Behold, I will set your stones in anonymity, basically alone, and I will lay your foundations with sapphires. Why would He do it with precious stones? Your foundations get covered up, but He doesn't care. He loves you so much. He pours in great value to even things other people can't see, but only you know. So just think of how much He loves you to do something like that. Moreover, I will make your battlements of rubies and your gates of crystal, your entire wall of precious stones. All of your sons will be taught by the Lord. And the well-being of your sons will be great. In righteousness you will be established. You will be far from oppression, for you will not fear. And from terror, for it will not come near you. If anyone fiercely attacks you, it will not be from me. Everybody needs to hear that one. If anyone fiercely attacks you, it will not be from me. Whoever attacks you will fail because of you, Behold, I myself have created the smith who blows the fire on the coals. Things can get hot. I created these situations. I've created these situations. Behold, myself, I have created the smith who blows the fire on the coals and produces a weapon for its work. Produces a weapon. Who are you? You are a weapon. He produces the smith that blows the coals that produces you. And I have created the destroyer to inflict ruin. No weapon that is formed against you will prosper. No weapon that is formed against you will succeed, and you will condemn every tongue that accuses you in judgment. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord. And their vindication is from me, declares the Lord. No weapon that's formed against you will prosper. But it doesn't mean that any weapon that formed against you won't inflict some damage. It won't prosper. It won't grow, right? That's our inheritance. Not to be removed from the conflict, but to be shaped by it. There's a few different ways I was planning on going, and I don't know if I'm going to do any of them today. And that's good. Honestly, if it's my decision to do things, it's bad, but if it's his decision, it's great. So let the Lord speak to that. But I do want to see, I felt like we get stuck in this rut of thinking that God moves very quickly, and God plays the long game. He plays the long game. When we think everything rests upon a moment, we have belittled how great our God is. If everything rests upon a moment, we've belittled how great that he is. We ran into a guy yesterday. I'm so encouraged. I mean, when I feel like the wind blew in my sails, it blew hard yesterday. Hard. We get up, we actually have a babysitter. We go to breakfast. We go to visit our good friend Will. We go to his restaurant where he's serving, and the lady goes, hey, it's going to be 3 hours wait time. So do you still want to wait? But if you go to the bar, you may be able to get in first come, first serve. So we're like, well, we'll go say hi to Will, and then we'll probably leave. So we go say hi to Will. And while we're standing there, 2 people get up from the bar, and he's like, hey, it's opened up. And nobody was around. 3-hour wait time, and nobody's just like waiting to pounce on this. So we go sit down. So 3-hour wait time gone, okay? Something's up. Will's in a good mood, say hi to him. And we sit down for a couple of minutes. And he's like, hey, I just brought the owner of the restaurant over here. He wants to come meet you guys. Okay, I want to introduce you. Hey, this is my family, da-da-da. And it seemed like the guy was kind of distracted or kind of nervous, but I felt like the Lord was like on this day already. It just seemed off. So we're eating breakfast, and I end up making fun of the plate of the guy who's sitting next to me, just joking around. I was like, hey, that looks terrible. And he's like, I know, it's horrible. Look at all this stuff. And as we struck up a conversation, and when it turned out, I said, hey, you don't look like you're from here. You look like you're either from Florida or you're from California. Just the way that you're dressed. I just know it, right? I'm from Florida. That just has that vibe. And he goes, well, he's like, I grew up in Des Moines all my life. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, maybe far off. But he's like, but I own businesses, and I worked in Florida, and I lived in California for a long time. So I was like, all right, nailed it. You know what I mean? So as we get to talking, he's a believer. Fantastic believer, right? He's an older gentleman, but he's seen a lot of things, and he was talking about in the 60s, I believe it was the 60s, Des Moines had a lot of disunity. There was a lot of civil unrest. He said, he's like, I grew up a believer. He's like, our parents were believers, our grandparents were believers, and we didn't see color, we didn't see division, we didn't see any issue basically hanging out together. But he's like, at that time, he's like, we literally had the Black Panthers and the white supremacists and all that other stuff. Grown people walking into our schools saying, hey, his name was, I don't want to say his name. I'm going to say his name is Tim. I'm making up a name. Tim. You can't talk to Jason over here. White dude and black dude. He's like, we've always been friends. We've been close. We've been family. He's like, you can't talk to him anymore. You hate him. You don't like that person. And he's like, we literally had Black Panthers coming into the school going, you cannot hang out with that person anymore. I'm going to watch you. You can't do it. You don't get along anymore. And he's like, they'd come into the schools and do this in the middle of classrooms. And he's like, there was like 40 to 60 something people had to be rushed to the emergency room because of one fight that broke out because these two groups of adults came into a school and started stirring up all this crap. And he goes, it was so foreign to me what was happening. But in the middle of this disunity, this wedge that was being drove into society between people, he's like the Jesus Revolution. And you see the film that came out, and that was happening. And he goes, my dad worked for the airline, and we could get free tickets. So we flew out to California from Des Moines every single weekend to go be a part of whatever God was doing out there, right? He's like, my dad just really wants to do that. So every week, Monday through Friday, lived here in Des Moines, played sports, and flew out there to go see what was going on. Came back and we see what God was doing. He was transforming stuff in the middle of disunity. When we felt like the world was on fire and nobody wanted to get along, God was just crushing it. He was speaking to the hurts and the fears and the afflictions that were happening. And anyways, when I say wind beneath my sails, it turns out that he was part of the team that helped create First Federated, which is in this building right here. He helped build the big wing on that side. He's been a part of great movements. But anyways, after he's telling me all this stuff, he goes, so where do you guys go to church? I said, we meet at Franklin Junior High. And he was just sort of like, I mean, we knew some of the same people back from my hometown, Jacksonville, Florida. We knew some of the same people, some of the same pastors, knew some of the same people in Tennessee, knew some of the same people in California, it was like one thing after the next, going, man, what is going on? And he goes, just keep your relationship with the Lord, number one, and know that he's always moving. He's always moving. And he began to speak to me. This guy, he was actually preaching to me a word right there in the middle of the restaurant. He began to speak to me and goes, hey, if you look where God took Abraham, and I looked it up last night, and where the land that he told him to go was Canaan. And he planted him right there in that spot. He goes, it would be a dry, desolate, arid, desert sort of a place, right? Not rich in abundance, not fertile, not any of this other stuff. But he goes, if you go about 100 miles north of there, he goes, all three continents meet. And from that place would be the greatest port or distribution spot for riches and goods and travel and commerce for the whole world was right there. So the land that he promised him that he wanted him to go to was going to be the greatest hub and distribution place that you could create on the planet. He's like, God plays the long game. He plays the long game. So if you think it was just, oh, Abraham, I just need you to go over there. I got this land for you. He was already preparing something far down the road. He spoke to Abraham about something that was happening 400 years in advance. And he told him, hey, your people are going to be enslaved, but after that, I've got a land for them. Now, what would you feel like if you're that person living in the middle of the 400 years? God didn't speak to me, and I'm not going to see it. You know what I mean? Like, I'm nothing, I'm a placeholder. But there was significance in the midst. We call it waiting, right? But God plays a long game. Moses was 40 years old. He gets kicked out of Egypt because of what he does. He spends 40 years in exile in the desert before he sees the burning bush. So he's 80 years old before God uses him. If you would have talked to him when he was 60, is God working in your life? Does he have a purpose for you? Yeah, he told me about the purpose. I've seen it, but I haven't seen the promise yet. Would he feel defeated? Probably. We get stuck on we haven't seen something in 1 to 2 years. We haven't seen something in 1 to 2 months. We haven't seen something in 1 to 2 days. Okay, Daniel in the lion's den, right? That whole story. How old was he? All my kids' books, right, always show Daniel in his 30s. That jerker was 80 years old.
Really?
Yeah, he was a piece of beef jerky thrown into the, you know what I mean? He wasn't like this. He's 80. Did my purpose end or did it start? We rarely see God's significance in the moment, right? So Abraham had Isaac. He was 100 years old. Now, all these large age gaps, what I'm saying is there's large periods where we feel like there's nothing in the waiting, right? We look forward to the promise and we just sit still where we're at, just waiting on it. And we forget that the waiting is the process to get us to the promise. It is designed to prepare us for the promise that we're just going to step into. So we think that there's no significance in this moment. It had to be created. It had to be created to prepare us for the promise. So when you look at God's promises for your life, right, you can't just seek, hear me out, because then I'm going to contradict myself. You can't just seek the promise and forget about the person that you're pursuing. You can't just seek the promise and forget about the person that you're pursuing. Now, and I said I'm going to contradict myself because it happens. Do you know that you can receive the promise and not have God in it? So like, okay, so Moses in the desert, God gets so, I'm going to say it in my terms, right? And then you guys can correct. God gets so frustrated with Moses. He's like, you know what? You can just have the promised land. I ain't going. And we make this big deal about, oh, you know, Moses saw the value in the person. When I say person, it's God, right? But you know what I'm talking about. He saw the value in the person, that relationship and what it would bring. And I can't receive the promise. I'm not going to enjoy it unless I have you, right? It's all good and well. But I want to press pause on this. God was willing to let him step into the promise without him in it. So if we think about the finish line and what God's promised us, you know that we can live in that and still not have him. We can be living in abundance and God not be active in our life. But we could be living in the very thing that he promised us. We pursued him, we delved in, we got a relationship, and he goes, I'm going to show you this thing, and you get it, and you can just put him to the side and coast. He was going to allow Moses and all those people to have the promised land without his presence. And that's a sobering thing for me, because if I just pursue the promise, and it's good, it's what God promised me, it's created and crafted by him specifically for me, for you, and I pursue him and he hands it off to me, I can literally just push him to the side. But I got the promise, baby. Isn't God so good? And be washed over by every weapon that comes towards me. But for those that pursue him and call him Lord, no weapon that's formed against them shall prosper. No weapon that's formed against you shall prosper. But there's something in the midst of that struggle that we're supposed to have. Okay? I'm going to give you a sort of a mental break, right? I'm getting some meat. Mental break. Here we go. The Apostle John. You know the reason why I do this? They say the average attention span is only like 3 to 5 minutes. So you're only on the hook for 3 to 5 minutes before you're off to somewhere else, right? Okay, so Apostle John, he was 16 when he started out with Jesus. 16. Now think about that. You ever seen the show The Chosen? Does he look 16? All right. Okay, so Peter was 30. He was the oldest. John's the youngest. Right? So Peter's about the same age as Jesus. And you hear this thing, you know, when Jesus goes to the cross, he talks to his mom, and he goes, hey, today, and he's talking to his mom, Mary, and he's talking to John. He's like, hey, this is going to be your son. Hey, son, this is going to be your mom. Now, if he was Jesus' age, it'd feel a little bit odd to be talking to a man and saying, this is your son, and it'd be a little bit different. But he was 19 at the time. Hey, Mary, this is your son. And we'll look at that time and say, hey, entrusted John to watch over his mom. Man, he was growing underneath Mary. Let's not discount the power that Mary had and the presence that she carried. Okay? We're not Catholics, but you know what I mean? Let's look at that. We often don't give women a lot of credit and favor in the Bible when we look at stories. But he entrusted the one that he loved unto the mother that he had. Okay, 19 when he dies. So for 40 years he goes to Jerusalem. He's there with Mary for 40 years. He comes back when he's 60 to lead Ephesus, which was the biggest church of that day. Had the most bodies, the greatest influence. So he leads in Ephesus, 85 to 87. All right? The last emperor, or this emperor, is called Domitian. I'm going to tell you a story that you've never heard before, if we have a little bit of time. Never heard this story. And I looked it up because I heard it and I didn't believe it. And then I got challenged on it. Did I look it up? And I was like, I didn't, but it was interesting and I trust that person. So anyways, 85 or 87-ish, this emperor of Rome, who lived in Rome, found out that there was one last living apostle. And he really wanted to put him on trial himself. So he goes, hey, go get that guy. But the thing was, John lived outside the city, and the laws really didn't pertain to when you lived right outside the city, right? They could control the hub of the city, but if you're out in the sticks, there wasn't really anything they were going to do. They weren't going to enforce anything. So when John went into town and he went to the temple, he didn't pay tribute, didn't light incense or throw in a coin to Domitian, the emperor. So he goes, gotcha. Yanks him back to Rome and decides to execute him after a trial. No big deal, right? That's what they did. But here's the story. The plan that he had for John, they used to kill him in one of two ways. They would put him on a skillet in the middle of a court and watch the whole thing go down. Like a skillet. A flat pan, big enough for a human. Wrap them up in rags and put them on that and basically just cook them. Or they'd have a gigantic pot of boiling oil and they'd lower them down really, really slow. And the point being, what they wanted to do was make sure that you knew that you were dying and you could experience every moment of death. That doesn't come from man. That just doesn't come from man, that sort of treatment. So they elected to drop him down in a boiling vat of oil. Lowered him down, and after he was head down, he ordered this gigantic meat hook to fish him out, right? To get his body to crank him up so he could see what he basically did, that he knew that he was dead. And this historian that lived about 100 years after this event happened, he's considered an early church father, really historically accurate, and the rest of that stuff. His name is Tertullian. He gives an account of this in great detail. But what happens essentially is when the meat hook goes up and comes up, John was sitting on the hook unscathed. And he got so wigged out by the power and the presence of God in that moment, and so scared of John that he ordered him to exile in the Isle of Patmos. Right? So John's 90-ish, right? That's when he gets the revelation, the book of Revelation, right? The vision from Christ, and he writes the book of Revelation. 90. Right? God plays the long game. There's so many things, because it was up to that point, and then he came back and he wrote the 3 other books, right? I believe he had already written his epistle beforehand. He writes the book of Revelations while he's on the island, and 18 months on the island, Domitian basically gets assassinated, and everybody that he wrongfully imprisoned on that island gets set free. John comes back and writes the other 3 books, John, 1 John, 2nd, and 3rd. So those things came out of a place of trial, saying, God's instilled this in me. Basically, he didn't give up. Right to the end, 90-something years old. Paul didn't convert till he was 33. 3 years until he started preaching, he just disappeared. Right? To be, it said basically to spend time with Christ alone for 3 years, to be prepared before he started preaching. 4 years later, Barnabas comes along and start working together. 6 years later, he sets off with Barnabas and John Mark for his first missionary journey. So 13 years after he had an encounter, basically, he goes off on his first trip. He died when he was 16. It's the long game. 3 years here, 4 years here, 6 years here. And we get frustrated about a month or 2 here or there. And Paul talks about often, we show there was a revelation of the power of the Holy Spirit through the works that were performed, greatly through patience. And he emphasizes the word patience. They have to look in the Greek, but it's an emphatic word when he talks about patience. Because he says, through patience they experience the works. Through patience they experience the power. Through long suffering, through endurance, through all this other stuff. We just get so short-sighted that it's in a moment that needs to be a power punch. That they saw the works of the Father displayed through patience. It took a while for this stuff to develop. When God's speaking to Isaiah, and he says, basically, I made the one who blows right on the coals to refine the weapon that I'm going to use. Right? Some of these things are necessary. So we finally get to my first slide, and we're about to end service. Perfect. 1 Peter 5:5. We'll get there. Okay. You younger men likewise be subject to your elders. And all of you clothe yourselves with humility towards one another, because God is opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Okay, so I want to underline this whole thing. Younger men likewise be subject to your elders. Basically, somebody needs to come under somebody else. This actually means age, both of them. Young men come underneath old men. All of you clothe yourselves with humility. What do you put clothes over? Right? Your skin? You put clothes over your flesh. So any part of your flesh, right, which is pride, flesh is pride, clothe yourself in humility. It's like cover your pride up, cover your flesh up. Clothe yourselves with humility towards one another. Towards God or towards one another? One another. Because, why? He always tells you, because God is opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. You're actually, if you read in that, I'm going to make a mountain out of a molehill, possibly, to somebody's opinion. But if you want to withhold grace from your life, go ahead and be prideful. If you want God's grace, and I talked about this often, but grace is God's operational power. You want God's operational power. You want his power in your life, become humble. You don't want it? Be proud. We'll get into that a little bit later. But you can withhold grace by your pride. Okay, so next slide. Therefore, right? If you ever mention a therefore, it's because the situation that just happened, because of this. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt you at the proper time. The reason why you need to be humbled is you're not likely to misuse authority when it's granted or given. If you're prideful and arrogant and somebody gives you more power, you're just going to use it for yourself. Right? So when Christ says, I give you all authority that was given unto me, right? I think that is a gift that can be granted and given. But I don't think that if God opposes the proud, that he's going to give you all authority at the same time. You know what I mean? Okay. So, what I mean by this is, okay, I got a 6-year-old boy, Reed. He likes to hit everything. You give him a stick, he likes to whack it. You take this, everything's a sword, everything's a dagger, everything's a gun, everything's a whatever. But if he came up to me and said, hey, Dad, can I get this machete? He's wielding possibly authority if I hand it to him. If he comes to me and goes, hey, can I have it? But I'm going to ask you how I'm supposed to use it. So every time I go to hit something, I ask you if I can do it. I want your advice on it, what I can hit, and where I can use it. I would be more apt to say, you know what, you can have it, and I'll work with you on it. But if he's like, I got it, I know what to do with it. I'm like, no, you don't, and you can't have it. You know what I mean? I don't need you, is what he's talking about. I understand what to do with it. Why would I hand him everything? He doesn't want a relationship with me. He just wants the weapon. Right? Okay. So 7. Sorry, I'm going to do 6 and 7. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God so that he may exalt you at the proper time, having cast all anxiety on him because he cares about you. And here's the deal. Anxiety is worry and fear about the unknown. If you can't be honest with yourself about why you're anxious, why you're fearful about the unknown, you can't give it to him. I'm going to give you another analogy. Yeah. Anxiety is fear about the unknown, right? If you don't know what's going to happen, let's put it this way. You ever seen the meme? It's Chris Pratt, and he's like, at this point, I don't want to ask. I don't know what that means, but at this point, I can't ask. He's fearful about it. Let's say you worked in a restaurant for a while, and you're always supposed to do something to clean out the grease trap, and you can't remember what it was, but you worked there for 2 years. And your boss is always getting on you about doing it right, and you're like, I hope I'm doing it right. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just figuring it out, right? And one time you're like, you know what? If I just told him I don't really know what I'm doing, but I've been here for too long, I can't admit that I don't quite know what I'm doing. Then I have fear about exposing my lack of knowledge or understanding. I have a fear about confessing that I should have known better or invested more time into figuring out what I should do, right? So you don't take it to your boss because you're fearful that you're going to get a reprimand or you don't get the promotion you're hoping to get later on or the raise or whatever else. But you're fearful about bringing it to him because you don't know what's going to happen once you do, right? Everything piles up. So once you get saved, you feel somehow like you should have it sort of figured out. We want to pull back and figure out, like, no, if he just gives me the sword, I figure out what to do. And he's like, man, if you just ask me what to do with it. But we get so anxious, fearful about what's going to happen if we confess we don't know what we're doing. We just don't know what we're doing. I've been married for 10 years. God, I don't know what I'm doing in this. How do I show her that I don't know what I'm doing, that I'm fearful of this? Because as a man, the unifying fear between every man is, I'm not good enough and I don't have what it takes. I'm not good enough and I don't have what it takes. And I don't care where you're at. If you're not shaking your head at me, I'm going to call you a liar. Because whatever you feel like you're called to, there's a part of you that feels like I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. What if Moses had received the promise and he knew from God early on? Because look, he got saved at the river in the basket to the palace. Then he killed the dude, got exiled. Gosh, the promise that God had for me, I'm not good enough. And I don't have what it takes. God promised all this stuff to Abraham. Gosh, the time, it's running out. I'm 60. Yeah, God, you had this promise for me. I'm 70. The promise is running out for me. I'm 80. Time's running out. I must not be doing it right. I must not be prepared. I'm 90. Come on. We got to come up with something. Right? 100. Kid comes along. I'm saying he plays the long game. Plays the long game. But that's the fear. If we can't confess him what our anxieties are, right? He can't speak to that thing. And when we can't confess our fear to him, right? I'm going to suggest we're prideful because I can figure it out on my own. Dad, I just want the machete. I don't want a conversation. I can just figure it out. I don't know what I can't hit, but I'll figure it out whenever you reprimand me. And then I'm going to call you a bad dad because, you won't let me use it how I want to use it. What I'm saying is, at the end of 7 it says, having cast all your anxiety on him because he cares about you. There's a lot of things that we don't confess to the people that we love because deep down there's a fear that maybe they won't love us, that they don't really care about us. Because if we give them our fear, will they turn it into a weapon? If I tell my wife I have a fear about not being good enough and I don't have what it takes, will she look at me and say, you're less than what I thought you were? And I don't know if I'm as committed to this marriage as I thought I was. Now, that's a fear of a young man. And I've able to come alongside like my helpmate, and I'm able to give her like those deep-seated fears and anxieties. And she can treasure it and help me move past that and minister to it. We are designed as a family to be able to confess those things to one another and not be fearful that we use as weapons. You know what I mean? Like Manny came up to me and said, I have a hard time not buying lottery tickets. Every time I get $100, I got to spend it. When you pull up to a gas station, he's like, man, I'm thinking about it. It's like, man, you don't screw up again. That would be the fear. If you tell me that you have a problem with it, that whenever you come into a situation, I criticize you for having the fear. Instead of saying, no, man, it's coming against you, but you're created and designed for more than that, right, man? You can push through it. That's a lie. That's why we need to talk to one another and be trusting enough and know that we can hand these fears and anxiety off of one another. Because if we're not doing it to one another, I struggle to believe we're doing it with all honesty with our Father. In all honesty. Okay. So 8, be of sober spirit, be on alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Lions always single out the weak, the sick, the isolated, and the young. They always single them out. You're isolating from one another. You're singling yourself out. That's why community is so powerful. So 9, so resist him firm in your faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brothers and sisters who are in the world. Share what you're in because other people they're in the same thing, right? Don't feel like you're unique. There's so many times you get up a fear that seems like the biggest thing that you've ever faced. And then you think that, man, I'm different than the person next to me. I'm unique. I'm unique in my fear. I'm unique in my struggle. I must be the only one who succumbs to something so simple and it's so big in my life. Ten. It's my daughter. After you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, the God of all power, right, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. But when will he do that? After you have suffered for a little while. seems like it's part of the built-in process. Well, why do you need to do that? After you suffer for a little while, God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. So get that mental picture in your head. And I was asking God about this. This is my struggle. This is my anxiety. This is my fear. I came to God and I said, look, I feel like I was born with some of these fears, some of these anxieties, right? Like it wasn't my doing. Like I want to blame it on Adam, right? Because of the fallen nature, I was born with these fears and anxieties. And he showed me this field. I get very vivid pictures in my mind. A little bit past. Okay. So he showed me this very vivid picture of a field with these huge holes in them, right? And he was speaking to me and he said, this field is meant to plant and to farm, right? We live in Iowa. This is so relatable to, the people around here. So you can't plant if there's a car-sized crater in the middle of these fields, right? These huge like bomb blast holes. And what I knew when I saw this picture of these holes, right? They were fears and anxieties. It's like, God, I can't plant, I can't cultivate, I can't be all I'm created to be till these things are filled in, right? And I would pursue him. Honey, go to Pappy. Go to Pappy. Or you can stand up here. Sorry, I think I just devastated you. I felt like I was not able to accomplish, right? I'm not good enough and I don't have what it takes because these huge holes, these huge craters that are in the middle of this field. And you could fill them with whatever you need to fill, but these were deficits, these were fears, right? And I could numb out and I can say that the spiritual warfare that I'm up against, I'm going to cast it, I'm going to give it to God. And imagine like a wrestling ring, right? WWE, WWF. I'm a child of the 90s and the 2000s. They were big, right? So you had like these tap out things, right? You go and you could tap somebody in like a tag team match, right? Yeah. And the way that he was showing me how this is in the middle of spiritual warfare, when I get overwhelmed by these fears and anxieties, what I can tend to do is say, I give it to the Lord. And it'd be like if I'm in the ring and I decide like, oh yeah, timeout, and I go sit in my corner. So what I stop doing is I stop defending myself and I say, oh, I'll give it to God, and I sit down in the corner. But if you're in the middle of a match, all it means is you're not defending yourself anymore and you're just going to get wrecked. And he said in the midst of this, when you cast it upon me, what you're doing is you're actually tapping me in your place. The fight hasn't started. You just let me step in and take over. But too often I get overwhelmed with some of these things, right? And I want to say like, well, I gave it to the Lord. What it means is I want to numb out and I don't want to fight anymore. I didn't really give it to him. I didn't really entrust him with it. I didn't really hand him over my fears and anxieties. And he was saying to me so much that he goes, basically, if they didn't exist, or those potholes, if those huge craters didn't exist, you would not have pursued me with such diligence to have me fill in those holes with what needed to be there. If that thing was perfectly flat and level, I would have not have sought him to put into the soil what needed to be there. I would not have dug out myself to ask him to fill that thing. I would not have pursued him as hard. I'm going to give you one, maybe two more analogies to this. Right? I'm okay with speaking in parables and not ending my stories. A bunch of other people do the same thing. So here's the deal. When you plant a garden, ahead of time you want to get started. So a lot of times people have plant starts. They put them in the basement, up in the windows, whatever else. And if you've ever done this, the temptation is it's in a controlled environment. So you don't have bugs or pests. You can water them whenever you want to. They don't have any, I can eliminate all forms of outside stresses. The environment could be perfect. And I did it the first time, right? I did it like that. And when you go to transplant them to the outside, the way that they have grown up to that point is not a realistic representation of the world that they're going to live in. So what happens is the plants grow really tall and skinny, and the roots don't go very far because they get watered on a perfect schedule. They're not against any wind, no bugs, no stresses. So when you put them outside, they instantly die, or they're very weak for their whole life. They need that stress. So when you grow them, you water them infrequently in the basement, and you put a fan on them. You need to stress the winds to blow, and it makes the stalks thick, and the roots have to go search for water. But if they know water's coming, they'll never search for it. And I was thinking about this with my kids, that so often I'll watch them struggle through things, and I want to step in and say, like, no, let me solve it for you. Let me fix it for you. Right? It's like growing my plants in the basement. I don't want to put a fan on you. I want a perfect little, you know what I mean, controlled environment with no stresses and no problems. And when I do that, I'm preparing them for a world that they don't live in. They don't actually live in that world. They live in this little fake little bubble. And when you expose them to the realities of the world, they'll get crushed. And so when they struggle through things, I want to be alongside of them as they struggle, not to abandon them, to be available to communicate through these issues. So when they feel like the struggle at the end, they don't have what it takes and they're not good enough, that they can look at me and say, you got this. Try it just like this. And they can start solving the problem and getting some self-confidence that they were created with an ability to connect with their dad, to seek out what they don't currently have. Guys, the stresses that we're up against, just like in verse 10, after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself perfect, confirm. You can't confirm something that hasn't already been spoken, right? So you already know something he's promised you to have, but he has to confirm it. Why? Because you have a doubt. Why do you have a doubt? You've been coming up against something that's been stressful and something that butts up against the promise. That he will perfect, he will confirm, and he will strengthen, and he will establish you. And I want to speak life into that. So when you ever get stuck in a spot and you want to know what God has planned for you and what his heart cares for you about, it's Isaiah 54, 10 through 17. That he hasn't forgotten about you, but some of those stresses are designed that you will be adequate weapons in the world that you actually live in, right? So you can come up against anything that's formed, and no weapon that's formed against you shall prosper. It doesn't mean you won't come up against stresses. You most certainly will. And they're designed to strengthen you and to put you in a spot to say, like, I don't know what it is, Dad. How do you do it? And he'll speak to you. It says, knock, and I'll answer and tell you great and mighty things in which you do not know. He knows it. My kids know that I know more than them now. I don't hold it against them when they don't know it. I just say, man, you haven't lived long enough. Right? God, man, I thank you so much for these nuggets of truth and of peace that you've spoken into our lives. Father, that let us see that you are always available, that you're always good, and you're always willing to hear the cares and concerns that we have in our hearts. That we can confess these things to you. We can bring our burdens of fear and anxiety to you because you care for us, that you want nothing but good for us, and that your promises for us are true. God, let us grow together as a family, more closely knit than ever before, sharing each other's burdens And the wind that blows into our sails, my life, and can also be the wind that blows into the next person's life. Let us be continually encouraged as we press forward and face the struggles of life together, knowing that it's for the purpose of building us all up. God, you're a good Father. Let us never forget that and always hold your name high. In Jesus' name, amen. All right.